Welcome to ShadowTalk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Brandon Tirado, Director of Gray Matter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today, we're examining why Exfiltration-Only groups are losing the extortion game, despite their operational advantages over traditional encryption-based ransomware.
So Q4 2025 was fascinating. Payment rates dropped down to 20%, and this is the lowest that we've ever seen. But what's interesting is victim counts still went up.
Yeah, and this is really a paradox that we're seeing right now. As we're seeing groups like CLOP, who have named over 116 organizations in Q4 alone, they're driving their success purely by data exfiltration with no encryption. Meanwhile, other groups like Quillen and Akira are encrypting and still getting paid.
So what's the disconnect? If exfiltration is easier, cheaper, faster, why are organizations refusing to pay, but still paying encryption-based ransomware demands?
Well, that's exactly what we're unpacking today. And the answer really isn't technical, it's more operational. As the extortion models that threat actors are using, they really determine whether the organizations pay.
And for defenders, you need a comprehensive approach. Visibility, detection, speed, containment. But the two extortion models stress test different parts of that chain. If you're weak on visibility, exfil-only groups will eat you alive. If you're slow on containment, encryption-based groups win.
And it's really the same defensive stack, but different pressure points in that stack. And most organizations have gaps in both.
Awesome. So let's start out with what's actually happening, in Q4. So John, walk us through, the advantages of each of these models, the ransomware encryption as well as the exfiltration, and who's winning with what.
Yeah, sure thing. And so kind of like we highlighted already, Q4 of 2025 was really a study in contradictions. Headlines are saying that ransomware is declining because the payment behind them have dropped to 20%. But in December of 2025, it was the most active month for claimed ransomware victims across all of that year. And the real story here isn't about the volume of organizations named, but it's about which models work and which don't. So let's really break these down. So to start, we have Exfiltration-Only, and it has three big advantages. First is the scalability. So if we look at the group CLOP, who has really pioneered this tactic, they are targeting vulnerabilities in widely used technologies that hold sensitive data. And this is really allowing them to scale things like automated discovery and exploitation to really compromise a high amount of organizations. Second, there's a lower operational cost for Exfiltration-Only. You don't have to build that encryption infrastructure. You don't have to worry about bypassing backup solutions. You don't have to provide support for your decryptors. And then finally, there's fewer defenses for them to have made. All they're concerned about is capturing the data, so they don't have to worry about disabling backups to stop the restoration from them. And they don't really have to worry about the typical EDR, I should say host-based EDR ransomware detections.
So I guess in other words, you'd say it's like CLOP is successful because they're skipping one of the noisiest parts of the attack.
That's exactly right. And we saw Shiny Hunters do something similar. They were able to name about 49 organizations in 2025, purely based off of exfiltration. But here's where it gets really interesting, because encryption-based ransomware has two overwhelming advantages. First of all is greater impact, which really leads to that operational disruption and forces immediate responses from organizations. Things like healthcare not being able to deliver patient care, manufacturing production lines coming to a halt, and financial systems freezing. And the second, they can add higher extortion pressure because they're not threatening future consequences like exfiltration is, but they're creating an active crisis that needs to be solved, ultimately leading towards greater ransomware extortion payments. And the victim count really does prove this. So as we look at the group's volume across 2025 for the number of organizations they're naming on their data leak site, Quillen named over 1,000, Akira named over 600. And these are two primary groups that are really leading the ransomware with encryption. Lockbit 5.0, which we talked about in an earlier episode this year, that even after they had significant law enforcement disruption, still focused their efforts when they returned to building encryption. And with that, they were able to name over 160 organizations.
So exfiltration only groups, they've made a lot of noise, but encryption based groups are still racking up higher total victim counts. And I think that really tells, us and our audience something about which model is actually working.
Yeah, I completely agree. And here's the real inflection point to focus in on. In our annual threat report for 2025, we found that 80% of the breaches we investigated were exfiltration only with no encryption at all, really showing that threat actors are testing this model to exfiltrate only at scale. But the payment rates behind that have really collapsed as organizations have really stopped paying those payments when it's only data exfiltration. And that's really forcing a reckoning on these groups. If exfiltration only is operationally superior, but payment rates are tanking, then why bother going through all that effort for those groups? So turn it over to you, Brandon. I'm curious. Let's talk about why organizations have really stopped paying. And because this is where the real operational reality hits that we've been driving at.
Yeah. So really the question is why did payment rates drop to 20%, right? And more importantly, are organizations refusing to pay data extortion specifically? And I really see like 5 factors that are primarily driving this. So, and that first being is, paying for data suppression doesn't change your legal duty to notify by any means. Once personal data is accessed or even exfiltrated in this case, regulatory frameworks like GDPR and US state breach notification laws are still requiring notice. And those obligations apply regardless of whether you pay or the attacker claims that they deleted their data. Second, payment doesn't reduce the likelihood of litigation. Affected individuals can still sue. Insurance claims still get filed and regulatory fines still land. Third, threat actors retain the data. There's a zero guarantee they delete it. They can selectively leak, recycle it for further and future campaigns, or even sell it on the side. It's like you're paying for a promise from criminals, and that alone, right? Like there's no honor among thieves.
Yeah, and I'm going to jump in here with the fourth one. And this is that engaging threat actors in the negotiations actually has a kinetic risk now, which seems a little counterintuitive. I found it rather interesting. But what organizations are noticing is that as they engage in those negotiations, they're experiencing things like the swatting of executives, or essentially where threat actors call a SWAT team to an executive's house to make sure that they are pressured into that payment. We're seeing harassment campaigns, DDoS attacks follow on. It's really not just cyber anymore.
Yeah, it really isn't. It's become quite scary to see that evolution. But and on the fifth part, right? The fifth part of this equation is organizations have matured. Executives and board members, they understand now more of the breach consequences than they've ever done before. Paying is not changing the outcome. It just is funding the adversary, and this is how these level and these personas are looking at this. So why are they still paying encryption-based ransomware? It comes down to one simple fact: operational disruption. When your systems are encrypted, businesses stop immediately. Patient care halts, manufacturing lines freeze, financial transactions fail. The pain is real time, not future. Backup restoration, even with a mature program, can take up to 24 to 72 hours due to all the validation and interdependencies that come with it. And so that's the divergence. Data extortion threatens consequences that you can't prevent by paying, whereas encryption-based ransomware creates a crisis you can solve by paying, but at least in theory. So now here's where this makes this operational difficult for the defenders listening. And I guess we'll start with the exfiltration-only threat. Clop didn't attack endpoints. They exploited the Oracle e-Business Suite and Clio file transfer solutions, technologies that most organizations don't or at least struggle to monitor correctly. With traditional EDR covering endpoints, SIMs covering logged events, but what about the application layer monitoring, the gateway anomaly detections, the data exfiltrating alerting coming from platforms like Oracle EBS or Clio? Most organizations struggle with this or don't have it at all.
That's a great point. And I think that there's a secondary point to this, which is that the SIM-centric architecture really creates a delay here of about 1 to 3 hours of a detection lag by its design. Data has to be ingested, parsed, indexed before any rule can evaluate it. And groups like CLOP are exfiltrating in just over 4 hours. So our SIM-based alerts that often fire are coming after that theft is complete. And as a little bit of a side note here, it's getting even faster. The time to exfiltration is really increasing. That's a little teaser for our annual threat report that's going to be releasing next week. You can find out just how fast they're getting. Be on the lookout for that.
Yeah. And so really the hierarchy here is visibility, detection, speed, and containment. However, you can't detect what you can't see. And if you can't detect it, containment speed is irrelevant. Now, on the flip side, moving on to encryption-based ransomware, right? In 2024, we saw attackers reach lateral movement in 48 minutes here at ReliaQuest. That was the average. In 2025, that window got even tighter. And to John's point earlier, we're publishing that exact number next week when we drop our annual threat report. So be on the lookout to look at that new number. The manual containment strategies is another key component here. We saw last year roughly 8 hours for a manual containment. Organizations with automated containment, the likes of blocking IOCs, rotating credentials, isolating hosts, can hit this in under 5 minutes, much of which we've seen with our customers here at ReliaQuest. But what this requires is pre-approved playbooks, detection accuracy and fidelity to avoid those false positive disruptions, and also the asset criticality tiers so you don't unnecessarily interrupt business operations. Most organizations claiming, automated containment actually have automated alerting with manual approval. And so that's still a 2 to 4 hour window. And by the time the defenders contain, encryption is already being deployed. So, and here's what becomes an architecture conversation, right? Organizations need, again, both visibility and speed, but visibility for exfiltration, you need to know where sensitive data exists, what its normal operations look like, to notice those abnormalities, etc. Now, for the speed for encryption component, detect within minutes and contain before lateral movement is the key to prevent encryption. But most security architectures force a trade-off. SIM-centric detection bottlenecks, everything through ingestion pipelines. Manual containment processes can't keep pace with breakout times being seen in minutes. In asset inventory, if you don't know which systems hold critical data or lack EDR coverage, you can't prioritize either visibility or speed. So if organizations are refusing to pay exfiltration-only extortion because the payment doesn't work, and they're still paying encryption-based ransomware because operational disruption is immediate, what do defenders actually build? That's what we're going to unpack right after this quick break.
ShadowTalk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Gray Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Awesome. So we're back. And before the break, we laid out why organizations stop paying exfiltration-only extortion, but are still seeming to pay encryption-based ransomware. What we're going to do now is let's talk about what defenders actually control. So John, let's start off with the foundation. CLOP exploited the Oracle e-business suite because organizations struggle to monitor it. What does asset inventory actually mean in this context?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's important to understand that it's not just about asking what IP addresses exist within our network. That's network layer inventory, and it's really surface deep. What we need is application layer inventory, answering questions like what software is running, specifically what version, what data does that particular asset hold, what's the internet exposure of the device, and what is the patch status. One of the reasons that CLOP succeeded in its Oracle e-business suite campaign was because organizations had limited asset inventory, and they're only able to answer questions like, we have a Linux server hosted on port 443. But the information they really needed is that we have an Oracle e-business suite server hosting version 12.2.4. It holds HR data that's vulnerable specifically to CVE 2025-6182882. and exposed to the internet. And that is really a gap highlighting the visibility problem. So for organizations, asset inventory really requires multiple complementary methods. Active scanning for IP-based assets, passive monitoring for new unknown traffic patterns, agent-based reporting, and application layer enumeration. What's actually running on that server.
Awesome. So once you know what exists, what's the prioritization framework in your eyes, John? Because you can't monitor everything with the same intensity.
Yeah, you really can. And kind of like we discussed on last week's episode about vulnerability management, it's really a prioritization issue for teams here. So we want to break it down in 3 tiers. Tier 1 is going to be those internet-facing applications, or I should say servers, web applications, file transfer platforms, VPNs. You want to patch these aggressively and monitor for exploitation. Tier 2 is going to be critical data repositories, anything holding your PII, your financial data, your intellectual property. You want to have strict access controls, vulnerability prioritization here, and monitor for data exfiltration. Now, there's an important sub point I want to make now that we've set up tier 1 and 2, and that's where tier 1 and 2 blend together, where you have a critical data repository that is also internet facing. That is your top tier within tier 1. And those are the things you should really be aware of and prioritize as we get later into some of these remediation steps. Finally is tier 3, the internal systems with limited exposure. You can keep those under your standard controls and patching cycles.
So visibility isn't just turning on more logging. That's how I'm hearing this. It's knowing what you have, what it holds, and where those gaps are.
Yeah, that's exactly right, because logging isn't always the answer. It can be costly to continuously enable logs. And if we're not taking the time to organize them properly, we're just kind of throwing things at the fire without really building a useful solution. So what we want to prioritize is for exfiltration defense. Visibility really is that prerequisite. You can't contain what you can never detect. So Brandon, over to you. You mentioned earlier that organizations with automated containment were able to hit that golden standard of containment within 5 minutes. What does that actually take to implement?
Yeah, and kind of similar to the structure, John, that you broke down. I'll break it down into three things. The 3 things, first being pre-approved playbooks. These are playbooks that business leadership and security need to agree on in advance. If we detect lateral movement on a tier 1 asset, we automatically contain the threat. No escalation chain during that incident. I don't need to reach out for manual intervention. Second is that detection accuracy. If your detections are throwing false positives and you're auto isolating production systems, you're creating operational disruption, and that's not going to help with your buy-in from the business on being able to do these types of things. You need confidence that when the alert fires, it's real. The third part here is that asset criticality tier, kind of like you were talking through, John. You can't auto isolate a payment processing server on some critical system. So you need a cybersecurity asset management tool that is dynamic and is tagging assets with context like this can be isolated without business approval versus this requires manual sign off, etc.
So what you're really saying here, Brandon, is that the organizations that are able to achieve that 5-minute containment, they've done the operational work. They're not just doing the technical integrations.
Right. Yeah. Because like most organizations, they have these tools, right? They have EDRs, they have SOAR, they have network segmentation in their environment, but they haven't done the governance, right? The pre-approved playbooks, the asset tagging, the false positive tuning. So there's automated containment that they're talking about is actually automated alert with manual approval. And that's taking still 2 to 4 hours. When attackers can achieve lateral movement in well under an hour, manual workflows arrive too late, often faster than your approval workflow can even start. So data theft can finish within hours and encryption can follow soon after. So if you're containing late in that cycle, you're doing post-mortem and you're not doing prevention.
So again, to reiterate here, speed without visibility is really useless, but visibility without speed just means that you're watching the attack happen in real time.
Exactly. And you need both, right? And the architecture that you have set up needs to be able to support that. So kind of, switching gears here or playing on this right here, John, let's talk about the SIM bottleneck. We keep talking about SIM and its place here. You mentioned a, couple hour delay, 1 to 3 hours in the detection lag. What's causing that and how do organizations get their hands around this?
Yeah, so let's really set up the problem, and that is the traditional SIM architecture. It requires data to flow through that ingestion pipeline. Logs get collected from endpoints and network devices, and then they get parsed, normalized, and indexed. And it's only after indexing that we can then have our detection rules start to evaluate them. We have things like batch-based collection, where our logs are collected in mass every 15 or 30 minutes. That's creating lag. As we're streaming the ingestion with real-time forwarding, we can get to sub-hour alerting in optimally tuned environments. But most enterprises run at that about 2 hour mark, like we mentioned, under normal workloads. This is not including those high volume events when everyone's in office and operating as they normally are. And that's making our indexing queues full, and that can extend our processing time up to 6 hours. So as we mentioned, we have exfiltration attacks often completing in 4 hours, which our SIM-only detection is really firing after that theft is done, highlighting a key problem here.
Yeah. And so, John, like, I guess what's the alternative, right? Organizations, they still need centralized log analysis for investigations, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're not telling organizations to get rid of the SIM. They still need their SIM. But what we're really asking for here is detection optionality. So it's important to understand that SIM is just one detection surface, but it's not the only one. Others to highlight are going to be at source detection, and this happens before the data hits the SIM. You also have in-transit detection or network traffic analysis and gateway monitoring that happens while the data is moving. At storage detection are things like our SIM rules and our data lake queries. Those happen after our ingestion. The best architecture really uses all three of real-time behavioral detection at source for speed, SIM correlation and investigation for compliance, but you're not bottlenecking every alert through the ingestion pipeline.
Yeah, John. So, and again, I think it goes without saying based on what we're talking about. So it's not replacing the SIM. It stopped making the SIM the center of every detection workflow.
Yeah, that's really the key here. SIM-centric architecture was really designed for the 2010s threat landscape. And now with attackers moving so fast, they really don't care about your SIM ingestion pipeline, if it's batch or if it's streaming, because they're already getting a foothold on those other hosts by the time our first events are firing and alerting.
Awesome, John. Yeah. So what we'll do now is let's move into some of the takeaways that our listeners can get from today. I'll take a stab and start with the leaders and the CISOs listening, and really what I see this come down to is three strategic decisions. First, board and executive communication. Payments rates dropped in 2025, but that doesn't mean ransomware as a whole is declining. It means organizations recognize that paying for data suppression doesn't eliminate notification obligations, reduce litigation risk, or even prevent re-extortion. Your boards need to understand why paying exfiltration-only extortion can be futile, but encryption-based ransomware still creates operational pressure. Second is budget allocation. Question here is, are you sacrificing security capability to feed SIM licensing bills for data that arrives too late? If your architecture forces every detection through a 3-hour ingestion pipeline, you're structurally disadvantaged against attacks completing in hours. Detection optionality at source, in transit, at storage is now an architectural requirement in today's threat landscape. Third, containment maturity. Again, we've seen sub 5-minute automated containment here at ReliaQuest. We know it's achievable, but it requires, again, governance and the right tools. Pre-approved playbooks without sign-off, asset criticality tiers to understand which hosts can be isolated under what circumstances, and detection accuracy to avoid those false positive disruptions. If you're claiming automated containment, but still requiring manual approval, you're lying to yourself about your response times. And here's your 10-minute morning action. Tomorrow, when you're getting in, pull up your top 10 critical data repositories, the systems holding PII, the financial data, intellectual property, etc., and ask your team these 3 questions. Does the system have logging coverage? Do we have alerting for data exfiltration? If this system were compromised tonight, how would we know about that before the attacker exfiltrated? If nobody can answer those questions, you just identified your visibility gap.
Yeah, and very similar to what you just laid out on the practitioner side, I recommend starting with detection hierarchy. Really outline those key things of visibility, detection, speed, and containment. You can't skip visibility. You need to inventory your internet-facing applications, as we laid out the things like Oracle, Clio, and those third-party file transfer platforms, the things we know that these threat actors are targeting. You want to know what versions they're running, what data they hold, what the patch status is, and what security controls are in place around them. Next, look at your detection engineering. Ensure that your detection rules are deployed for your data exfiltration patterns, things like large outbound transfers and non-standard API uses. Also look for rules for lateral movement, including RDP and SMB anomalies, internal network scanning to identify those additional hosts to move to, and finally, rules for your pre-encryption behaviors like backup deletion attempts and encryption process execution. Of your rules that you have laid out, identify which ones have the highest fidelity. And this is a really good place for you to build your automated containment around. As we mentioned earlier, you want to have certainty that we're not isolating or not taking containment actions around false positives. And finally, build those containment playbooks. Document your decision trees around your asset tiers. So if we have a tier 1 asset compromise, can we auto-isolate? Can we contain the threat by blocking an IP address or resetting a credential? For our tier 2 assets, have alerting and recommendations of isolation. And then tier 3, you can alert for investigation. Again, we want to have that pre-approval from legal and business to make sure that we're all under the same page before that attack occurs. And test quarterly, because if your playbooks aren't tested, then they'll likely fail when you need them the most. So your 10-minute morning action tomorrow for security defenders: audit your internet-facing assets. Specifically ask, what data are these devices holding, and what is the risk or the extortion pressure if that data is exposed? Cross-reference these assets against your logging. Any system that's internet-facing without logging in detections around it, that's your first step. Start there.
Yeah. And so look, right, the ransomware landscape isn't getting simpler. Organizations still face pressure from both the extortion-only and the encryption-based ransomware. Really what this comes down to is defenders need both visibility and speed. And most importantly, the architecture needs to support it. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of ShadowTalk. If you'd like to get in touch, we're just an email away. You can send your questions over to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can get next week's episode delivered to you directly on your podcasting platform of choice. And we really appreciate if you can rate and review ShadowTalk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of ShadowTalk.